Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of KN Talks. I'm delighted to be joined today by Amemiya Hirokazu, which I hope I got right, and Abbey Schultz from Kojima Law in Tokyo. I'm really delighted they've agreed to talk to me today about the difference in M&A practice between the UK and Japan. And it is very different. When we were talking about the content of the podcast in advance, I was surprised by how much. So welcome to the podcast. Thank you for agreeing to do this. And perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about Kojima.
Okay, Kojima Law Offices is focusing on the cross-border matters, including the merger and acquisitions. And we have four foreign licensed attorneys, including Abbey-san here. And I'm Hirokazu Amemiya, and I'm doing the merger and acquisition here. I have been practicing law for 20 years.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much again for making the time, Hirokazu. So, should we just jump straight into it? What is the biggest difference between UK and Japanese M&A practice?
Well, especially among domestic Japanese transactions, most M&A agreements, especially pertaining with representations and warranties, are standardized. They are very concise and more general, and this has to kind of do with the Japanese business corporate structure, which takes a long time for the approval process, because usually lawyers in a company have to go up through the corporate ladder to reach decisions. And so it takes a very, very long time. So that's why you see most M&A agreements standardized and concise in Japan.
And when you say concise, what kind of length of documents are we looking at?
Usually we're looking at, when I say concise, we're looking at more general warranties like seller ownership, or especially with the share purchase agreements, we're looking at usually like target company basics. So those are types of things that we'll find in such agreement, but especially with Japan's reluctant to have exceptions for those type of warranties because of just the corporate structure and how long it takes to go through the process.
Okay, so is it the case that the warranties are, in the UK, we would be very specific about what we were asking, but in Japan, would it be a general question along the lines of, are there any issues with a particular question rather than a statement of fact which disclosures are made against?
Yes, like it would be more like, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but usually with like UK contracts, they're more specific, and especially with their disclosure schedules, like they try to capture a whole lot of risk allocations. Whereas with Japanese M&A agreements, they don't usually, with domestic transactions, it's more general, and the disclosure schedules are pretty incomplete and not as specific. And that just has to do with, again, like the corporate structure. But then this can always change depending on different variations, like the complexity of the transaction, the trust between both parties, whether there's an international entity involved. So between domestic Japanese companies, it's more general, but that could always change depending on the situation.
Okay, and as an incoming investor, so say if you're a UK company looking to acquire a Japanese business, it sounds like you would end up with a schedule that was longer than it would be in a domestic transaction, just because of the cultural differences, levels of trust. Would that normally be the case?
Can I?
Yes.
Yes, right. But technically speaking, rough and simple representation and warranties are favorable to the buyer. So when a seller acquires a Japanese target company, generally speaking, simple representation and warranty are good to UK acquirers. But the problem is Japanese legal doctrine. So actually in Japan, there are very few cases which the parties fight each other at the court and get the judgment. So there are not so many precedents. But one precedent said that when a seller knows or negligently doesn't know the facts, then the seller cannot claim the breach of representation and warranty. So technically speaking, when during the due diligence, seller knows various things about the target company. So even under the simple representation and warranty, sometimes sellers are prevented from claiming against the buyer. That's a problem. So it's better to have the specific and detailed representation and warranty, and also it's advisable for the UK acquirers to have so-called, what is it?
Sandbagging. Yeah, anti-sandbagging clause.
Yeah, maybe sandbagging clause.
Yeah.
Yes.
We have a similar concept in the UK coming from some case law in the late 90s. And we normally include a clause in our document that will define the seller's knowledge. And it will say that the ability of a seller to bring a claim might be qualified by the actual knowledge of certain individuals in the deal team, because some of the case law involved quite minor members of the deal team in the days of hard copy data rooms rather than virtual data rooms, having seen something and the decision makers not knowing it. So we do have similar provisions, but
yes.
I think perhaps because we're slightly less trust-based as a culture when it comes to M&A, we tend to have very detailed documentation with detailed disclosures, but then claims are still quite rare because hopefully we've flushed out the issues and everybody can look back and say, well, you knew about that without having to rely on knowledge.
It makes sense.
So are there any other kind of exceptions or cultural practices around exceptions to the warranties? Because as we mentioned earlier, in the UK, we will have quite a long disclosure letter and disclosure of everything in the data room, that kind of thing. How's disclosure approached in Japan?
I think disclosure is usually, it depends on kind of the various factors. Like disclosures usually between two domestic Japanese companies is usually going to be incomplete, or not as specific as if there was a international entity involved, because usually with Japanese agreements now, they adopt a more international standard, especially in relation to the US, the UK, and Australia. So when you have those type of parties involved in Japanese M&A agreements, you'll see more lengthy disclosure agreements compared to if it was just two Japanese companies.
Okay, excellent. So it will be relatively familiar as a process if you're coming in from outside, or you're selling a business that you've previously invested in. Okay, interesting. So if I am coming into Japan from outside, are there any particular kind of other cultural issues that I should be mindful of when I'm approaching negotiations in relation to an M&A transaction?
Japanese company prefer the simple and short agreement. So maybe it's the same issue as representation warranty, which you discussed. And also, they prefer simple structure of the closing. And they rarely use the escrow agent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, they don't use representation and warranty insurance providers. So they tend to take the simple ones closing.
Yes.
And sometimes we use the installment payment, but it's not so typical. So that will be maybe surprise some UK practitioners.
How long would a transaction normally take from a client coming to you and saying, we've agreed to buy this company, to actually closing the transaction? Is it like a month? Is it a bit longer? How long does it normally take?
Yeah, it really depends. But even though we employ the shorter agreement, some company takes much time, and especially very traditional manufacturers takes long time to conclude the agreement. This is because they need the international discussion. Yes, of course, it takes time to negotiate with the opposite side, but it also takes longer time internally. So of course, when you use the bid process, it takes a shorter time. But if you don't take the bid process, it takes years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Because in the UK, even with our more detailed documents, you typically say roughly 3 months to get a transaction done these days. And everybody will just throw themselves at it. But it sounds like it can be quite a bit longer if it's a big company with a lot of internal process. And
a big company tend to use a bid process. So it is short, it becomes shorter and shorter, but it still takes, based on my experience, 1 year or 10 months or something. So it's much longer than UK practice.
Yes, that is a lot longer. So people will need to appreciate that in their business timelines when they're looking at expanding into Japan. That's really interesting. And one more question, just on consideration, being conscious of what you've said about trust in Japan, do you have a lot of mechanisms like earnouts to adjust the consideration depending on future performance? And if you do, something that's always a big issue for an earnout in the UK is who's going to run the business during the earnout period, what protections the seller's going to have. Is there a lot of discussion about that, or is it relatively standard?
Yeah, we sometimes use earnout, but it's only for cross-border transactions. For domestic transaction, we don't use earnouts, and also we don't use escrow agent or something. We Japanese companies prefer the simple closing. So, when Japanese companies negotiate with UK companies or US companies, then they request earnout or something. So at that time, the Japanese company will start thinking about accepting that idea.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's becoming popular, but for domestic transactions, no.
Okay, that's very interesting. In the UK, we probably see 80-90% of our transactions have an earnout. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
It's a lot. It just de-risks things slightly for the buyer. And you can sell it to the sellers as you will get more money. Here's your headline number that looks very big, but the earnout targets perhaps are quite difficult to achieve. So there needs to be some real performance. Yeah. That was really interesting. I've learned a lot about Japanese M&A from the emails that we swapped in this conversation, which is great. The real takeaways being the kind of standardization, that people shouldn't really be expecting the same kind of detailed warranties and disclosures that they would get in a UK or US transaction, and actually the length of time that it's going to take to actually get the deal done, that people will need to understand and be sensitive to that. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been great. Obviously, any listeners who are thinking about acquiring a business in Japan or investing in Japan should get in touch with Hirokazu or Abbey and Kojima generally. They're a great firm, and I'm sure we'll be delighted to help you with any of your Japanese legal needs. Thanks very much again, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.